Hi everyone, it's Nicola back in the Stitches and Slapdashery sewing room. It's a Sunday morning and it seemed like the perfect time to pop another tutorial onto the channel. So I've been making a rather large amount of these little pods. They are perfect for things like earbuds or stitch markers or coins or whatever. They have a little swivel hook attached to them. Not a heavy duty one, just a little tiny 1/2 inch thing so that you can clip them onto a handbag or a backpack. This was my first prototype. It came out pretty well. I then made a big batch of different ones in different prints, and they're cute in any print, really. Some of them came out a little less than perfect on the shape. I was pretty slapdash. Are you surprised? When it came to cutting, I did make myself a template for the inner circle, but I was freehanding, cutting the fabric out with the seam allowance, and it was pretty dire in places. So some of them came out a little bit more, shall we say, beetle shaped, oval shaped than they should have done, because I had to make sure all of my layers were incorporated when I sewed all the layers together. However, I have now made myself templates for all of the pieces. My cutting is more accurate, and I made this one today. And this is the one you're going to see me making in a moment. It came out pretty well. Yes, it's still slapdash. No, it's not perfect. But it's a fun little item to make and to use, so hopefully you'll enjoy making one of your own. As you can see, I've made quite a few of these. They look like a stack of pancakes, don't they? My first one was this one. It came out really well. I just did a paper template in a circle and then cut my interfacing and then rough cut the fabrics about a centimetre more or 3/8 of an inch more extra around for the seam allowance, and it came out really neat. Then I decided to make a whole ton more. Let's put this one aside for a minute. So this batch I made as a chain piecing or batch sewing thing. As you can see, some of them are a little wonky. Definitely a little wonky. They didn't come out exactly round, and some of them aren't exactly symmetrical either. Occasionally the zipper doesn't look like it's in the middle. So having been really slapdash with those guys, I thought, okay, let's belatedly try making a template. So I used this craft mat stuff from the dollar store, and I made a 4-inch template. And I just used a set of compasses, a good old-fashioned compass from an old geometry set to do my 4-inch, and then I did a 4 3/4 inch circle for the fabrics, so that would allow for the seam allowances, and I even did a little tiny template for the zipper tabs. Started out with a 2-inch square for some of them, but then I decided to go a little narrower for the zipper width and a little longer. So if you want centimeters, that one is 10 centimeters in diameter, 4 inches. 4 3/4 inches is 12 centimeters diameter, and 1/4 inch by 2 1/4 is 3.5 centimeters by 6, approximately. And I made this one. You can probably tell it's not round. So it depends on the zipper you're going to use. I used a number 3 zipper. They were really long and I just trimmed them. There was quite a bit of waste. If you had 6-inch zippers, those would probably be ideal, because then you could make this and use a little bit of the zipper that you cut off for the tab to hold the swivel hook. But because the zipper obviously took it in a little bit much, I ended up having to sew it a bit smaller, and so it came out kind of ladybug shaped. This would be really cute if you made it in a fabric to look like a ladybug, because it's the perfect beetle shape. Anyway, it doesn't have to be perfectly round, does it? Got my label in there, and it's lined, and there are no raw edges. I figured out how to make it without raw edges. Now, because I'm a little slapdash here, you can see some of my stitching. You'll see why that happened later on if you watch the video, because this is my first round of stitching when I added on the right side to the back, the exterior fabric, and then when I sewed on the lining fabric, I didn't exactly sew over the same line. And you could certainly make this a lot more neat. I machine sewed the turning gap, but it would probably look a lot nicer if you hand sewed it. But really, you're never ever going to see that because it's tucked away in the recesses of the pouch. The first thing you're going to need is either a way to draw directly on your interfacing and fabric, or you can make templates like I did. If you're making a lot of them, it does make sense to make templates. The first thing you'll be doing is tracing your small 4-inch square. No, you won't be. The first thing you'll be doing is tracing your 4-inch circle onto your interfacing. Now, the stuff I've used in these is just scraps of polyester batting. Low loft polyester batting. It could be pretty much anything. If you wanted this to be super neat, you could use fusible fleece. I'm just using what I have in my scrap bag. I'm using a zipper. It's way too long for what I really need, but I'm getting to the end of my number 3 zippers. I bought them pretty cheaply, and I'm not too worried about cutting some off. A little swivel hook is nice, or some sort of way to attach it to a bigger bag or something. Just need some scraps of your exterior fabric. I'm using this because this has got quite a large print. I'll fussy cut it to make sure that the pattern lands nicely on the outside, bearing in mind that on the top you're going to be cutting that piece in half and losing a little bit of the print. And then I'm just using this random piece of fabric, which doesn't really go with anything, as my lining, because you barely see it anyway. And of course I have a label ready on my ironing board, so I don't forget to attach it. I have a neutral thread in the machine, just a dark grey, because when you're doing a batch of them, it's nice just to do them all the same colour. That way you're not faffing about changing thread all the time. You will probably want to make sure that you have the correct foot on your machine. I am going to take my walking foot off and just put my regular foot on, because then it's easy to switch out the regular part for the zipper part. Just using a regular pen to draw around my 4-inch circle straight onto my interfacing. I have my fabrics prepped. I've got my 2 4-inch circles of interfacing. I have 2 4 3/4-inch circles of lining. I put my label right across the center of it. I've got 2 pieces of exterior in the 4 3/4, and I'll probably use this one for the top because I don't mind cutting it in half. I think this would be kind of nice to leave it intact. I've got 2 zipper tabs cut. Have my swivel hook ready. Now, getting the zipper prepared, this just requires a little bit of extra thought rather than just hacking it in pieces, what we want to do is just pull the puller back and do a little bit of stitching across here so that you can cut off the metal. That didn't work out as well as it normally does, but isn't that always the case when the camera is on? So I did a little bit of bar tacking across there, and I'm going to cut that piece off to get rid of the metal, but keep that zipper held together there. Now I'm going to measure my zipper. I want that to be 3 7/8 of an inch long. I actually have a ruler type thing printed into my, or molded into my sewing machine table there, but you probably can't see that. So let's use this ruler. And I'm going to go and mark 3 7/8 of an inch. And let's see, what's 3 7/8 of an inch in centimeters? It's just under the 10 centimeters. You want it a little shorter than the finished width of the bag. So probably 9 3/4 centimeters, maybe 9.5 centimeters. So now that I've marked my zipper, as you can see, there's a lot being cut off here. I'm going to cut right across there. And there's my teeny tiny zipper. And what I'm going to also do is I'm going to use a piece a couple of inches long of this part for my swivel hook tab. If you don't have spare zipper, if you really only have a teeny tiny zipper anyway, you can use a bit of ribbon or twill tape or your fabric and make a little tab for that. So I think we're all set to start on the sewing. I am just going to get my 505 basting spray and put the interfacing on the back of my exterior fabric. Don't spray your hand, which is what I just did, and now it's super sticky. Now I've centered my interfacing on this fabric. And I did do it in the right place. I just thought I'd done it on the wrong piece. So both of my right sides now have interfacing basted on. You could, of course, quilt it or fuse it if it's fusible fleece, whatever works. And now we're going to put the zipper tabs on. So I've ironed my zipper tabs right sides together because I'm going to enclose the raw edges of the zipper in the tab, like that, and sew across with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. It's about 5 millimeters. My brain and my mouth don't seem to be quite coordinating today. And then I'm going to do the same on the other end. And just to keep it neat, I am going to press those tabs away from the zipper. The zipper is all ready, tabs and all. I'm also going to prep this little swivel hook because I know if I don't, I'll probably forget to put it in. So you just need to thread your chosen piece of fabric or ribbon or whatever through there and put a little bit of stitching across near the end, near the raw end. Just holds it and stops it from pinging open when you don't want it to. So that's those two things ready. Now, I'm going to take my solid lining, which is going to be the one that's underneath the top of the little pouch, and the top piece of my exterior, which I have decided is this one, and I'm going to put them right sides together, and I'm just going to pop over to my cutting board, cutting mat, and cut them in half. So I'm just going to take a ruler, quilting ruler, and because this is, or should be, 4 3/4 inches, I'm going to cut, I'm just going to line this up with my 2 3/8 mark, slice it down the middle. I now have 2 semicircles there and 2 more semicircles there. Now I'm ready to sew the zipper in. I'm just going to put my zipper foot on. Now I don't bother using double-sided tape for this. It's just such a small zipper, but I do sew them separately. So I'll put the right side on first, sew it, then the lining side. So just take one of your semicircles and pop it on here. Now your zipper tabs are a little oversized, so they may stick out a little beyond where they need to go. Just make sure it's centered. That looks pretty good. I'm going to sew it from the zipper side, so I'm going to turn that around. I need a couple of clips. Just pull my puller to the end here. So you want to make sure when you're sewing your zipper on, the important thing is to make sure that the tab is within this interfacing area. It's looking maybe a little wider on the right hand side there. But what you don't want is to have the actual zipper teeth going into your seam allowance. That's what we're trying to avoid by putting the tabs on. So I've got a little bit of space here and here where it's just tab in my seam allowance. And the zipper actually starts over here somewhere. You probably need to lift your foot and just pull your zipper pull out of the way. And that is sewn. I might make a conscious effort to leave the zipper seam allowance a little narrower this time. I think I might stick with this. Normally I go closer to the teeth, but I think this time I won't. Yeah, I've got 1/4 of an inch seam allowance there, or 5 millimeters. And I think I'll stick with that. So now that you've done the first side, you just need to grab one of your lining semicircles and pop that on the other side. Make sure to match up where the corners of your outer fabric or your non-tab fabric are. Make sure to match up this part here. If you want to trim your zipper tabs to save getting confused, that's perfectly acceptable. And now I'm just going to sew this seam again from this side so I can see where my previous stitching is. One thing I don't like about zipper feet, and you can't see where the needle's going exactly. Anyway, got it pretty much close. So now that side's sewn in. I'm going to go and press that, and then I can top stitch it. Now for the ones I've already made, I used my zipper foot to top stitch. I got a little bit of puckering. Whilst I was able to smooth it out with my thumbnail, I think I'm going to finish installing the zipper at both sides, and then I'll switch my foot to the other one to do the top stitching. So you take your other exterior semicircle, and it's going to go on the other side of the zipper. Again, you want to make sure that it's all lined up with the previous one. Make sure the two right sides of your exterior are facing each other. Pop a clip in. Maybe get the puller out of the way first. That's one side done. And then we just need to pop the other lining semicircle on there. You've got the right side of the lining facing. You should have the top edges matching and the ends matching. And you just need to open that out. And press it. Now this half, my edges are working out pretty nicely. On this half, for some reason, it's short. These things happen. Popping my regular foot back on there, and I'm going to top stitch. I'm going to go to a longer stitch length, 3.5, and move my needle over. As you want to trim any excess zipper tab off at this stage, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to leave it until I've sewn my next part together. So this is what I call the zipper unit. A little bit of a pucker there, but it's going to be inside. No one will ever see it. This is where the slapdash comes in, folks. Just so as you know. Right, the next thing to do is to add my little swivel hook unit. And I want it on the zipper pull end when the zip is closed. Managed to do it the wrong end at least once already, so you know, have to pay attention here. So I'm just lining it up right over this area here. It fits in there beautifully. Get your raw edges matching, and then you can baste that in. Make sure you've got your needle centered again, because I nearly didn't. Okay, so that's basted in, so it won't shift when you're sewing the next part. Now the next step is to grab your other exterior, intact one, with the pretty print on, and the interfacing, and put it face down on top of this part. If you want to line it up specifically, you can, but I'm not going to be too picky about that. Just going to pop that on top. I like to use my larger clips for this. There's quite a bit of thickness here. Now ideally you want this uncut part to match this zipper unit. As you can see, they do vary in size a little bit. This is sticking out a tiny bit here, but that's all right. And this is not coming quite as far in as I would like, or rather out. It's a little bit short. If I sew along my interfacing edge here, it's going to be a very, very thin seam allowance. So if yours is looking a little dodgy like mine. Oh, and one thing I didn't mention is make sure your zipper's open at this point, at least 2/3 of the way. This is the point at which you may have to fudge the shape. If it's not working out perfectly like mine, then you may have to sew from this side to make sure that you've got enough of a seam allowance. So I am going to check this. I think what I may do is I will sew from this side and I will make the seam allowance a little bit smaller on this side compared to this, but making sure it's incorporating the fabric, and then this side should look fine. What ideally I would want to do is sew around the edge, just outside the edge of this interfacing, and it would work perfectly, but it doesn't always work out perfectly. So I'm going to start on this side using a 3/8 of an inch seam, or 1 centimetre, and be just a little careful on this side where there's not quite enough fabric. So I used a slightly larger than 3/8 of an inch seam so that I could fudge it and make sure I was including this in my seam allowance. And as you can see, I was pretty close. It did have to go a little bit inside where I ideally wanted to be on that side, but this was perfect. So far, so good. Now what I need to do is take my other piece of lining. Because I have a label on there, I'm going to line up the length of the label with the zipper so that when somebody opens it, it'll be showing as straight as possible. I want to line up as best as possible all the edges of the fabric. Oops, missed it. Here are all my pieces clipped. Now my zipper is from here to here. So I want to have a turning gap away from the zipper. So over on this edge is good. So I make a little mark. Don't make the area too small. Believe me, you'll save a lot of time if the area is a little bit larger and it's quick to turn. I think I'm going to make that just a little bit bigger, because it's very frustrating when you're struggling to turn it through a tiny gap. So I'm going to start sewing here. I'll back stitch. I'll go around on my previous row of stitching from this side so I can see it, and I'll finish and back stitch over here. Ignore this one. So I'm going to sew from here around to here. Exactly on the same place that I sewed before. Now I know you perfectionists out there are cringing at my slapdash methods. Feel free to apply your own level of expertise to this project. I wasn't going to do a tutorial for this, but when I showed the finished results off in the Ravelry group, the dodgy bag make-along. Someone said, "Oh, I hope you're going to do a tutorial for that." And I'm like, yeah, I can do that. So unfortunately, you're stuck with me. Now you just got to put your fingers between the layers of the lining, and then sometimes you can wangle the zipper a little further open to make it a little easier to push it through. Okay, and we're going to push everything through the gap. It's a good idea to check whether you've got all your layers safely caught before you go sealing up the lining. That looks good. So I'm just going to turn it back the other way and sew the lining shut. As I say, you might be a perfectionist and want to hand sew the lining. That just isn't me. Got to tuck all these layers in. This is why it's a bit easier to leave the seam allowances a little bit longer or larger, wider, that's the word. Otherwise you really end up fighting with them. Grab a couple of pins here. As a guideline, if you can get the folded edge of this side of the lining to the stitching line that you can see on the other side, it'll be pretty good. And pin as much as you have to, because it wants to fight you. Well, it did fight me. It popped out and I had to resew one of those bits there. But it's done. Now all that remains is to push it back the right way out. The zipper up. And give her a good steam. And there it is. It may not have been perfect inside, but it actually came out better than a lot of the others. If we want to be really picky, we could compare it to our 4-inch template. Whew, yeah, that's actually one of my better ones. I think it did pay off to keep the zipper seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch instead of going further in, closer to the teeth. I'm pleased with that one. I hope you enjoyed watching me make that. As usual, it was probably a lot more wordy than a lot of other tutorials. Some people hate that, some people love it. I feel like my videos are probably good for beginners because I'm going at a slower pace and also explaining what I'm doing as I go. And also explaining how to get around inconsistencies in your sewing. This one came out pretty well, I thought. Anyway, I hope you have a fantastic week. And I'll see you again soon with something else.